All right, so this is ethics and economics. Lincoln Stephan says, the social problem is not a political problem. It is an economic problem. Kropotkin says the economic problem is not an economic problem. It is an ethical problem. Thorstein Veblen says there is no ethics in modern society. R.H. Tawney says there were high ethics in society when the canon law was the law of the land. The high ethics of the canon law are embodied in the encyclicals of Pius XI and Leo XIII on the social problem. And then I wanted to look at the alternate ending here. So after the line about there are no ethics in modern society, in an unpublished version, he gives us, conspicuous spending is the prevailing practice in modern society. A man with 3 bathtubs thinks he is a better man than the man with 1 bathtub. A high standard of living has now taken the place of a high standard of loving. Honestly, I picked out this one to talk about because of that bathtub line. I think it is my favorite line in all of Peter Maurin. It's unfortunate it's not published. It's in an unpublished version. Luckily, we have the complete Peter Maurin now, so we can read it when we want to. But yeah, I think that one of the things I've really been appreciating about the Catholic worker movement in the past few years is this critique. And it's not new. It's just what I've been thinking of. Just the conspicuous spending is the prevailing practice in modern society. And it's only gotten worse, or I don't know. Do I want to say it's gotten worse? These things have always been bad. It's hard to say society is better or worse, but like, I think of like people who drive giant trucks or something as like the modern version of the people who have 3 bathtubs instead of 1. Like, yeah, some people might need 3 bathtubs. I've lived in a Catholic worker house with a few dozen folks, and it's nice to have more than 1 bathtub. But that's not everyone. And similarly, like, people like having giant trucks, even if some people need it to haul stuff, but most people don't. And then we find ourselves in a world of just like cyclical consuming. You're buying more gas and whatnot too. Yeah.
I'm trying to think it. I mean, Casa Maria here in Milwaukee, we're not just, we have multiple houses, but in none of our houses do we have 3 bathtubs. One of the houses we have 2 bathtubs and a shower, but we haven't reached this level that Peter Maurin is talking about. But granted, our houses most of them were built kind of to be rooming houses. They're meant, obviously I think he's referring perhaps to single family dwellings. And
yeah, well, and back then even to have plumbing at all was something. Like Dorothy writes, I believe, about being in like New York City and not everyone having plumbing. So it is a social, 1 bathtub is just practical, but like 3 really is going to be some sort of social status, unless you live in a convent or something like that. I don't know.
And yeah, thinking of your example of cars, I think when new houses we're here in Milwaukee in a very, all the houses are over 100 years old, but you go to a suburb where there's a new build. The main focus of the house is the garages normally.
Yeah.
Unless they're so rich that they have, sometimes like the uber rich will maybe have some law where the garages cannot face the street. So that's supposed to make an impediment so that you need to have enough money to build there that you can have a winding driveway that'll make sure the garages are off to the side. But if if you just have regular money and not that kind of extra money, most of the new builds, yeah, they face the street with usually a double garage and a single garage that really dominates. It's like, oh, there's a bunch of garages and I guess some people live there too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could go down this rabbit hole all day of just like how our modern society, like the infrastructure generally is built to accommodate vehicles over people. And I mean, maybe that's not unrelated. That is very much capitalism, right? Like they can then sell you a car and they can sell you tires and they can sell you insurance and they can sell you gas. And they don't really want you to know your neighbors. They want you to drive to the store and buy something. If you don't have the tool, don't ask your neighbor. Or yeah, it's capitalism.
And at the begin to go back to the beginning, which I think is it's all tied together with the other Lincoln and Kropotkin.
Mm-hmm.
You have Peter really wanting to show how all these problems are tied together, the social, the political, the economic, and how all of that is tied into ethics. Because there were folks at the time that, well, even now, where economics is viewed as maybe more of a science, or if you for those people that really buy into all this, the this kind of invisible hand of the market, and they really, for folks that really buy into that version of capitalism, it is supposed to be separate from the ethical. It's kind of, they want to compare it to physics. So it's just a simple science, where Peter really wants to show all of this is tied to get, all of this economics, and how many bathtubs we have and how many, garage stalls we have is tied into our politics. It's tied into the social problem, which is an ethical problem, which obviously, he doesn't, well, then in the original version, he brings in canon law or church law. Obviously he wants to bring in that religion at its best should be able to have an answer to these problems. And for Peter, I talk about this in some of the other footnotes in the book, but he has this vision of canon law, which I don't think I think he idealizes it based on some of the people he's reading at the time. I don't think it was ever like he thought it was. I don't think he's trying to be dishonest, because there were just Catholic writers who were writing at this time period and juxtaposing canon law with the Roman law, and that the canon law was the original law of the church, and it was geared towards helping the poor. Its emphasis was on justice for the poor, and juxtaposing that with Roman law with an emphasis on property, which we'd see is perhaps the purpose of the nation state, to protect private property. And he wants to juxtapose these. But I think his point is fair, that economics is an ethical problem, and we need to bring, whether if we're Catholics, bringing in hopefully the best of our Catholic tradition, but if we're coming from any perspective, to realize that this is an ethical problem that requires us to make judgments on the current capitalist economy, and to mold the economy according to something more that has more morality.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of think of maybe as like a modern example. Let me know if you think this isn't an apt thought. I think of like defunding the police a little bit as like an intersection of all of these economic, social, political problems. Like, and how do we respond? I mean, at the center of like abolition is using resources for community needs is the correct economic, political response to like the social problem of harm. and that those are tied together. Like if when people are poor and cannot have their needs met, it is an economic problem that spills over into the social. And how do we politically address that? And I mean, obviously, the answer from the state has been increased violence, and Joe Biden wants more of it. He said recently. So yeah, so that was kind of my thought on a current iteration of all these things coming together.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think every social movement is really a way for those leading the charge to state this isn't the way it's supposed to be. Like there's a morality. We might think, well, obviously for all of us living now, the police have just always been, and they've become normalized through hundreds of years of their existence, and there are, the Black Lives Matter movement has played an integral role in saying just because something is normalized doesn't mean it should be, and there's a moral implication, social, political, they're all tied together, and we need to make judgments on this and act to change our society.
How do you think this canon law line plays today? And maybe this is like a bigger question, like what is the role of the Catholic Church within the Catholic worker movement? Even is like probably if you asked 100 Catholic workers, you'd get 110 answers, kind of thing, But I don't know. Like I talk to my friends, some who are not Catholic workers sometimes, and I can kind of talk about a lot of what Peter would be about and get some okay responses. But if I were to say, back when the canon law was the law of the land, that's what we're looking at, that'll get some different responses. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I think it helps that at least he tapers it a bit with the last, or with the near to last line there, that the high ethics of the canon law are embodied in the encyclicals of Pius IX and Leo XIII on the social problem. So obviously, even he wants to emphasize a certain part of the canon law. The other thing is that at least canon law in its current form came about in 1917. In 1917, so not too long before Peter was writing this, there had been canon law, church law proclaimed at councils and from the Pope, going back to the early church, but it had never been brought together in one place. And what they brought together in 1917 was definitely for the governance of the church. So it's not, if someone just, and then John Paul II updated it in the early 80s. I don't remember the exact year, but it was a major update, but really it's meant for governing the church, where in the early church, some of the church law was meant to, some of it was, he is correct that it was meant to protect the interests of the poor, that after Christianity became legalized, the emperor actually gave Catholic bishops some authority over certain legal matters. And so there was canon law or church law to help them settle disputes. And much of the time it did have an emphasis on making sure that justice was given to the poor. So, but that's so far removed from our current domain and from what canon law means today, that yeah, if I had to go somewhere and I could recite 3 essays, I probably would skip essays where Peter Maurin is promoting the canon law.
Yeah. I did in the past couple of years read these encyclicals from Leo XIII and Pius XI. There's some good stuff in there. I mean, I guess it only took me a decade in the Catholic worker movement to get around to actually reading those, despite that, like, supposedly one of the purposes of the movement is to draw attention to these documents. Um, there was some good stuff in there. I don't know. They're not great because part of me is like, they spend a lot of time arguing against socialism, which part of me is like, okay, I'll concede some of these points, but like, let's talk about capitalism and how terrible things actually are under it instead of like how bad they could be under socialism or something, you know?
Yeah, Peter is, I mean, even when Peter is kind of quoting different papal encyclicals, he is very selective. He's always selective in when he quotes anything. So, there can be the charge that sometimes he's taking things out of context. And with the encyclicals, I think Peter doesn't mention this because he never really mentions his criticisms about them, but you can read the criticisms by what he omits. And, part of the encyclicals, but we see this also in the US bishops used to put out statements on like the economy and war, and both these encyclicals, which have some good stuff, and those bishop statements on the economics and war from the 80s, which had some good stuff. The big problem with all of them is they're really written for and focused to help change policy. Like, they're written for governments. They're not, I think they're assuming that governments will actually care what they have to say and change their policies. They don't really empower or have a role for regular people or Catholics to do something about the current situation, and that's the little that they do that, or at least when they're talking about what society should be, Peter will latch onto that, but then say, and there's the Catholic Worker Program to move us in that direction. He isn't saying, President Roosevelt, listen to, you saw what Pius XI wrote. Why isn't this happening? He's not putting out those asks. His asks are to the bishops and to the church and to Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm realizing, I'll just, as I did with the first essay, we forgot the last stanza because it's on the next page.
I'll take responsibility for it. I was the one who read it. To apply the ethics of the encyclicals to the problem of the day, such is the purpose of Catholic action.
So we see there what we mentioned in the first essay, this word Catholic action, where at this point, this is before Dorothy starts the Houses of Hospitality. They're just a newspaper, and they're hoping the bishops will get involved, that this will be bishop-led Catholic action to transform society.
Too bad that didn't work out the way they hoped it would. Or maybe not. Maybe then we wouldn't have the Catholic worker as we know it. Who knows what it would look like if it got absorbed by the bishops or whatever.
It might have been the best thing that happened to the Catholic worker movement.
Yeah, maybe we'd be more of a corporation right now rather than an institution.
It's hard to say. Hard to say.
Yeah. Do you think that this is a goal that has kind of been left from the wayside for most Catholic workers, promoting, or do you think it depends on who you're talking to? I mean, we are a wide group of people.
I mean, when it comes to the social problem, is a political problem, is an economic problem.
No, I meant more of the promoting the encyclicals as an answer to our problem.
Depends on the Catholic worker, but I mean, I don't always remember exactly what I'm reading where, but I believe I'm accurate in stating that the New York Catholic Worker has published portions of like Pope Francis's latest encyclicals. I think especially the one on the planet and the environment, they published chapters of it. And
a number of communities were excited about that one, and I saw it in a handful at least of worker papers.
yeah, but I would say it's, 10 years ago were encyclical, pre-Francis, and for a period of time there were encyclicals being published or emphasized. And probably not. And I think they're just, the limitations are there. They can maybe help. I think as Peter used them, they're a way to maybe broach the topic, say this topic matters to the church, but then he and Dorothy would go in a different direction with how to handle the problem.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It can be almost like an appeal to authority too, I feel like. At least that's how I sometimes use these texts. And it's like, oh, you're a Catholic. Well, the Catholic Church says that company is supposed to pay like not like a thriving wage, like that is an official teaching. Like, I don't quote all the encyclicals, but when I'm arguing with the capitalist Catholic, I will quote that one, kind of thing.
Leo the 13th said that they should be paid enough that they can get a piece of land and support themselves on it. Are you paying enough for them to buy a piece of land and support themselves on it? Yeah, well, he says frugally, but still, they still need to be able to purchase the land to live frugally on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the means of production, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe one of the more powerful parts from Leo's statement. He wanted, if that ideal had been upheld, workers should be paid enough that essentially they'd have a choice if they actually want to show up for work or not, or just support themselves on their piece of land.
That's an interesting way to frame it. If they want to show up to work or not.